All right, thank you everybody again for your patience. We can go ahead and get started. So first of all, I'm Amy Cook and I'm with McIntyre Communications and I'll be moderating today. And we are so honored to have with us today Cindy Blackstock, Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and a professor at McGill University School of Social Work. As most of you know, Cindy has over 30 years of experience working in child welfare and Indigenous children's rights and has published on topics relating to reconciliation, Indigenous theory, First Nations child welfare, and human rights. Cindy's service and work has resulted in hundreds of thousands of services being provided to First Nations children, youth, and families. Cindy has been documenting inequalities in funding since 1997 and has been actively involved in litigating since the initial complaint was filed in 2007. We're so lucky to also have two other participants on this call that are able to speak to legal inquiries as legal counsel to the Caring Society. Sarah Clark, who is the principal of Clark Child and Family Law in Toronto, and David Taylor, who is a partner at Conway Baxter Wilson in Ottawa and who can address any questions in French. Thank you so much to you both for joining us today. And I'm now going to pass it over to Cindy for her remarks on today's announcement.
Thank you, Amy. I want to recognize that I join you from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. You know, we're here today because of the spirits of the children in the unmarked graves, who captured Canadians' attention in a way that they could not look away from the horrors of residential schools, and in a way that provoked Canadians to ask new questions about what is going on right now on our watch. We're here today because of the residential school survivors who told their truths and put equity in child welfare and Jordan's principles as top calls to action because they didn't want their grandkids going through what they went through. And they knew they were. First Nations kids were going into foster care at higher rates than in residential school. We're here today because of Jordan River Anderson, the founder of Jordan's Principle. And this is his baby blanket behind us, gifted to us by his family. A child who was told, no, you're not worth the money. You're not getting the same kind of help as other kids. And as a result, he never spent a day in a family home. He spent over 2 years unnecessarily in a hospital. We're here because of youth in care across this country. Young people who were taken from their families, not because the service providers made the wrong decision, but because the service providers were given none of the tools by the government of Canada to keep them safely in their families. And those kids grew up in foster care. And they didn't want to see their younger brothers and sisters go through it either. And we're here because of the murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls and their families who left the legacy of fixing this whole unequal treatment of First Nations kids to all of us. You know, you heard a lot in a previous press conference about discrimination. Well, what does that actually look like for First Nations kids? Well, I think a child we were working with really got captured it best when they said, discrimination is when the government doesn't think you're worth the money. So what does it look like if you're one of those kids that aren't worth the money? Well, not only are your families not going to get the help they need to recover from the trauma of residential schools, you're also going to get less money in education. You're going to get less money in early childhood programs, in fun things like culture and in education and recreation. And you also got less money in health. And sadly, many Canadians judged you as if you were getting more. That's a situation where we walked into when in 2007, we filed this human rights case against the Canadian government. We, the parties, the Assembly of First Nations, the Chiefs of Ontario, Anishinaabe Nation, Amnesty International, and the Canadian Human Rights Commission, we were just fellow travelers who are trying to break this pattern of these courageous and dignified children and families screaming into silence into the public narrative. We wanted this type of apartheid service delivery to stop. You know, some will say, well, you know what, all the public pressure and all of the litigation wasn't necessary. It wasn't necessary to involve people like Sarah and David. And that $40 billion is a lot of money. Well, $40 billion is a lot of money. And I would say that it was necessary, first of all, for us to litigate to change Canada's pattern of giving First Nations children less. And second of all, we needed the Canadian public to awaken to the injustices. This case shows you that public pressure can work. But these agreements in principle are non-binding, and nothing changes in the lives of children today. We need to commit ourselves to keeping watch on the government of Canada and holding it accountable until it lands some of these things. So what did life look like before we brought this case, and before the tribunal issued its historic 2016 ruling, and before the 20 non-compliance orders against the federal government, and now for First Nations kids? Well, one of the things that you need to know is that First Nations families had almost no supports to keep them recover from trauma residential schools. And they were losing their children at record rates. First Nations kids, as we sit here, are 17.2 times more likely to be in foster care. Why? Because of poverty, poor housing, caregiver substance misuse related to multi-generational trauma, and domestic violence. If we were able to deal with those kinds of inequalities, we would actually have a far greater chance of being able to address the hardships and keep families together. So there was nothing there. But now, thanks to the pressure, thanks to the advocacy of children themselves and to the litigation, First Nations families are going to get prevention at $2,500 per person starting April 1st. What about youth in care? What about these kids who ended up in child welfare care because they were not given the same help as other kids? Well, youth in care have been courageously advocating for decades to say, you know what, when we turn 18, don't just turn us out onto the streets. Help us with housing, help us teach us those things that our parents should have taught us, like how to cook, or to get a safer place in a neighborhood where we don't have to be scared anymore, or to have someone to call when we're really not certain on what decision we should take in life. There was none of that to First Nations kids. As of April 1st, those First Nations young people who are aging out of care and those who are for young adults who have aged out of care will be getting those supports at their actual cost. What about buildings? We've all seen a housing crisis on reserve. That's not going to be fixed by this judgment, but we will be able to help fix up some of the family homes so that if you have a child with respiratory disease or other things, the answer isn't place them in another home. The answer is fix up the home that's existing right now. You know, we think about Jordan's principle. I remember when the federal government was saying, Cindy, don't worry about it. There are no Jordan's principle cases. Jordan and his situation was a one-off. In fact, they were saying that as recently as 2017. They were saying, you know, we've tried to find these people and they're not there. But thanks to public pressure, thanks to awareness in the communities themselves, now over 1 million services have been given to children that they otherwise would have been denied. And what about the government? You know, it talks about needing to fix the child welfare system, but I would say that there's a big fix that needs to happen before that. And that is we need to fix the government itself. It is a repeat offender against First Nations children, first through residential schools, then the 60s scoop, now by giving these children less money for public services. So their families don't have the same opportunity to succeed. These kids don't have the same opportunity to succeed. What do we do about fixing the federal government? Well, it was very recently this fall that the federal government was saying there is no discrimination, that we were fully compliant with this. We're not even litigating against First Nations kids, but thanks to the public pressure, thanks to Canadians not turning the page and keeping an eye on Canada, the government is now acknowledging that it needs to be fixed. That is a huge piece of this puzzle that's really, really important. Also on compensation, compensating, frankly, children who lost their lives, children who lost their childhoods. Canada was saying, and Sarah and David and Anne Levesque were there, our other lawyer who's on this call. Canada was saying they don't owe any compensation to these people. And now they're at a place where they're at least going to hopefully honor the $40,000 as a floor that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ordered. So public pressure and litigation and all of us paying attention has made a world of difference. But these are simply words on paper. It is not time to look away, and it's not time for any of us to exhale. I'll be able to do that when I can walk into a community and see a First Nations child and be able to ask them how their life is going. And they tell me that today is a better day than yesterday was. And you know what the good news is that at the front of this case all the time have been children. And even today, I got this thing in the mail, this letter in the mail from kids outside of Toronto. And they're saying that every child matters. But you know what they say in their letters? Is it's not enough just to write it down, that we all have to pitch in and help. And that's what we're counting on all of you to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy. So now we're going to open up to questions. And again, just a friendly reminder that we will be allowing one question and one follow-up per person. And please keep your mic on mute until your name is called. And we would like for you to use the hand raise function that's just at the bottom of Zoom there. You should be able to see it. And then for any French questions that come in, we do have David Taylor here who can answer those in French. Okay, so I see Stephanie Taylor, you have a question here. You can unmute yourself. Go ahead there, Stephanie.
Hi there, Dr. Blackstock. Thanks for the time. I want to know, what kind of process do you want to see in place when it comes to providing compensation, and what assurances have you received from the government of what that process will mean for those who are eligible to receive at least the 20 billion?
Thank you for your question, Stephanie. For us, the position has been is that the children are entitled to, as a floor, the $40,000. This is a compensation they're entitled to for human rights damages, for the fact that they were discriminated against. We recognize some children would deserve more because of the severity of harms, but that number has to go up, not down. The other thing that we're looking for is we want the money for the children to go into a trust so that it is there for them because they were the victims of the discrimination. And we would strongly encourage something called a structured settlement for vulnerable young people, so that the funds are not all landed out at like one big lump sum to a person who's still struggling with the multi-generational trauma. And that as we were told by Youth in Care, we convened a group of Youth in Care, and I just want to put a shout out to Ashley Bach, who led that work, and to the Assemblies of Seven Generations. And what they were telling us is there needs to be mental health supports, there needs to be financial literacy supports. The Royal Bank of Canada has worked with us to be able to kind of create those financial literacy supports. And also networking and plain language information for anyone who is able to access it. So those are some of the things we're going to be looking for in this compensation deal. We still have standing at the Federal Court of Appeal and before the tribunal. So if there's anything that happens that's not in line with that, we'll have a fora to be able to voice that concern.
Thanks. And I guess for a follow-up, what's your understanding of timelines? Everyone's looking forward to later this year. Can you get any more specifics? What barriers could get in the way to that? What could perhaps expedite things? Anything more you can provide on timelines for compensation?
Well, the federal government could pay it now. I've always said the $40,000 should be paid. We actually have a framework that would provide for those kinds of mental health supports, et cetera, that's been approved by the tribunal. There's nothing stopping them from cutting the checks. I think what they're going to be looking for, though, is for the federal government or the federal court to approve their class action. We are not a party to this agreement in principle on compensation. They have signed it with Class Action Council. Hopefully it covers off our concerns as well. But it has to go to the federal court, and that probably will take over the summer into the fall to do.
Okay, thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Stephanie. We have Global News Ottawa Bureau up next.
Hello, Dr. Blackstock. David Baxter here from Global in Ottawa. Yeah, I was just wondering, with wanting to see more money for children with different severity of harm, can you give us an idea of what kind of criteria you hope the government uses to determine who suffered greater harm in the foster care system?
Yeah, what the first question is what we don't want to see happen. And that is to recognize that the vast majority of these victims are still children. We're talking about 5-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 14-year-olds. So you'll know that in the residential school process, they actually would interview victims in very detailed ways that would re-traumatize them to be able to kind of cost out the harm. Well, that absolutely cannot happen in this situation. That means we need to use evidence-based kind of indicators that are publicly available to us. And unfortunately, because Canada is one of the few countries in the world that does not have a national child welfare system, database system, we're going to have to use things like number of moves of children in care. It may be based on the child's age. We know when a child is removed at a younger age that the harms are greater. Those are the kinds of markers that we're looking for those upward adjustments, but under no circumstances do we feel it's appropriate for children to be interviewed.
All right, thank you. And just for follow-up, I guess a separate question. With the 20 billion being earmarked for communities, I know that your organization is not one of the partners there on the settlement. But what areas would you like to see prioritized? As you mentioned, you're still hopeful of the areas that you want to see are covered off there. So what would you say would be your top 3 priorities for community investment?
On the community investment stuff, it's prevention targeted at the drivers of why First Nations kids go into care at 17.2 times the rate. So that's culturally based family addiction services. It would be culturally based programs to address multi-generational trauma. It would be the government of Canada taking measures to end the inequalities in the other federally funded public programs. I've been saying this for years, and I'm not the only one. Canada could have settled this case for hundreds of millions of dollars back in 2000 when we raised the alarm that First Nations kids were getting 70 cents on the dollar compared to other kids, and families were being separated unnecessarily. But Canada chose not to do that. And now we're into the tens of billions of dollars. And most importantly, children have lost their lives and sometimes their childhoods in the process. So it's in the public interest that Canada remedy those other inequalities like water, et cetera, that continue to pile up on families and create a lot of stress. So that would be the other. And of course, that post-majority care that has been called for by young people in care absolutely needs to get out the door.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Anne Charlotte, you are up next.
Hi, thank you so much, Ms. Blackstock. If you don't mind, I would ask my question to David Taylor since I want to answer in French. En fait, je me demandais si vous pouviez un peu réagir à l'annonce de l'entente de principe d'aujourd'hui. Puis, qu'est-ce que vous pensez des balises de temps qui ont été mises pour indemniser les enfants qui ont fait partie du système de protection de l'enfance?
Donc, certainement, comme la Dr. Blackstock avait dit, aujourd'hui, c'est une première étape. Donc, c'est des ententes en principe qui ont été conclues suite à des longues discussions ces dernières semaines. Mais il demeure juste ça, c'est des ententes en principe. Puis, comme la Dr. Blackstock avait dit, c'est effectivement des mots sur le papier. Donc, ce qu'il faut voir dans les prochains mois, c'est d'autres discussions, des discussions approfondies sur les aspects techniques, surtout du réforme du système, pour comment est-ce qu'on va améliorer la vie pour les enfants dans les communautés, pas seulement maintenant, mais aussi pour l'avenir. Donc, il y aura des ententes finales qui seront négociées ici plus tard dans l'année. Certainement, l'espoir, c'est d'avoir quelque chose quelque temps au cours de l'été. Mais comme la Dr. Blackstock avait noté, il y aura des démarches en cour fédérale pour la compensation, pour approuver l'entente concernant la compensation, et puis par la suite devant le tribunal pour approuver l'entente qui concerne la réforme à long terme du système.
Donc, ce que vous auriez souhaité, c'est défendre tout de suite et pas cet échéancier qui a été fixé plus tôt.
Mais certainement, comme la Dr. Blackstock avait indiqué, notre position, surtout sur la compensation, a toujours été que, surtout depuis le septembre 2019, on a des ordonnances indiquant que les enfants victimes devraient avoir 40 000 $ chaque pour la discrimination qu'ils ont subie. S'il y a un paiement qui peut s'effectuer plus rapidement, malgré le fait que les ententes finales ne sont pas en place pour couvrir le recours collectif qui couvre essentiellement plus d'enfants et de familles et allant avant les procédures devant le tribunal et qui pourrait aussi compenser davantage les victimes qui ont souffert plus durant leur temps dans le système. Certainement, ça serait quelque chose à appuyer, c'est de bouger plus rapidement puis rendre cet argent aux victimes parce que c'est certainement c'est quelque chose qui est leur droit depuis, comme j'ai dit, au moins septembre 2019 quand on a eu les premières ordonnances du tribunal.
Merci, thank you.
Thank you. We have Brett Forrester with APTN.
Hello, thanks for putting on this press conference. As Dr. Blackstock pointed out in your introductory remarks, this has been going on for a very long time, close to 15 years now, I believe, next month. So at what point or under what circumstances will the Caring Society drop the complaint at the CHRT and wind up the litigation there?
Thank you for your question, Brett. I just want to acknowledge, by the way, that one of the ways that this case became publicly known is because broadcasters, Indigenous broadcasters like APTN, actually filmed this case in the earliest stages and actually brought an action against Canada to be able to film it. So I just want to recognize that work and the role of the media in educating Canadians, which has brought the public attention, which has contributed to this change. So I just want to say that important work. In terms of when we'll drop the complaint, it's really when the tribunal's orders are satisfied, when Canada has ceased its discrimination in the provision of First Nations Child and Family Services and Jordan's principle at the level of the child. That's where we measure it, not on paper. Are children no longer discriminated against in the way that the tribunal found? And then the other big piece, Brett, is that we have to make sure that this does not happen again. Within the Canadian Human Rights Act, there is a provision that allows for the prevention of the discrimination ever happening again. And that, to me, is probably one of the most important pieces of this work ahead of us. Is I would feel so sad if all of the collective effort that has gone into bringing this case over this last, not only the 15 years this case has been going on, but the many decades before that where the issue was raised and left unaddressed by Canada, if all that effort was made only to have equity for a few years and then have the discrimination happen to another generation of kids. We owe it to the survivors and the youth in care and the families who were told their kid wasn't worth the money to see this thing through to completion.
Thank you. And as a follow-up, I suppose the parties seemed very far apart on a lot of issues, but following the federal court deal, there seemed to be a renewed push to get things done. So what changed in the last 8 weeks that led to a final coming together on some of these outstanding issues?
Well, I think the federal government losing in federal court in such a profound way really was a lot of encouragement for them. They have always pinned their hopes on addressing this case on legal technicalities, and the federal court didn't have any of that. They just found their arguments to be completely unacceptable. So they lost across the board. And so that left them with the choice of either going to the Federal Court of Appeal and trying to get them to hear their arguments. And by the way, we've been there before, and the Federal Court of Appeal on a separate matter didn't agree with Canada anyway. And also there was the growing public pressure. And by public pressure, I mean Canadians really being touched in their hearts by the spirits of the children in the unmarked graves and the survivors in a way that compelled them to create change. I think those two things together really culminated in creating more of an opportunity for the government to recalibrate where it's going. It either continued with its losing litigation strategy and have the public pile up on them, or it decided it could be a real history maker. It could be the first government in history to actually accept responsibility and end the injustice. That was the choice for them, I think.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Brett. We have one more here, Janelle Mendez.
Hi, Cindy Blackstock. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us today. So I do have a question for First Nation communities who have implemented Indigenous child welfare sovereignty in their community. How will this compensation impact them, like such as Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan?
The compensation would be payable to any victims of discrimination because, of course, this case goes back to 2006. The class action goes back to 1991 that predates what the act respecting First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children, youth, and families. The one important issue that we really need to talk about, though, is that the federal government does not believe it is bound by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders when a First Nation draws down jurisdiction. That is very concerning to me because the funding structures and levels I've seen the federal government offer to First Nations who are assuming jurisdiction are really inferior. They remind me a lot of the past funding arrangements. So one of the things we need to do is make sure that when First Nations assume jurisdiction, that they actually have an equitable base that really is calibrated to the needs of those particular children in their communities over time.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. And it looks like we do have another question here by Sean Vanderklis.
Hi, Cindy.
Hi, Sean.
Just a quick follow-up to Brett Forrester's questions. I mean, it's taken us 15 years to get to this point, and I don't think it's with I don't think there is that possibility where the government decides to drag this out. So is there a timeline in place that you're willing to concede to the government before you willing to drop the CRT ruling?
I don't work on timeframes when it comes to seeing when the discrimination ends. My hope is that Canada would move quickly. It has a plan in this agreement in principle to land and end this discrimination within the year. We'll see if they get it done. And the other important thing to understand about this litigation, Sean, is that Canada has been the one extending the litigation recently. They're the ones that put the appeal in the Federal Court of Appeal. They're the ones who appealed the 2 decisions up to the federal court. They're the ones that appealed the capital order. So in our situation, it's not about the Carrying Society dragging out litigation. It's about making sure that those orders are satisfied. And Canada should be withdrawing its appeals that it currently has before the Federal Court of Appeal and before the Federal Court on Capital. I think that's really important. And I just wanted to see if Sarah Clark, our counsel, had any comments on that.
Thanks, Cindy. No, I mean, I think that that's right. What Dr. Blackstock is saying is that there is enough runway over the next 12 months to stop the discrimination and to actually prevent it from recurring. What the tribunal has ordered all of the parties to do, but of course, the onus is on Canada, is to implement real change to ensure that the discrimination is not repeated, so that another generation of children are not experiencing the level of discrimination or the types of discrimination that we have been dealing with in this case. And so if Canada can do that, then the orders of the tribunal will be satisfied. Ultimately, it will be up to the tribunal as to whether or not the orders have been satisfied and the complaint can be closed. And as long as we keep working together and working hard, that it is possible for that to happen.
Thank you.
All right, and thank you, Sean. Any more questions before we wrap up today? And just a friendly reminder that my email is in the chat. So if you do have any follow-up questions that come up later, feel free to, you can contact me there. And it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So thank you again to Cindy, Sarah, and David, and to everybody for joining us. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.